Paul Tryanowski. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer at the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and I'm pleased to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Puneet Dwivedi from the University of Georgia. As well, we have other members of the SFI staff on board with us. Rocco Saracena is here with me in Washington, D.C. We also have Darren Sleep, who is the newest member of our conservation staff. He joins us from Canada today as well. So we're pleased to have you with us. As a reminder, a couple of things, just a bit of housekeeping to get started. Please remember to mute your phones throughout the call. There's always a surprising amount of background noise that can be generated just by folks just to have their lines open. So you can help us all by keeping your phones on mute. Also, to let you know that this conference is being recorded so that you and others can listen back to it at some point in the future and be able to share that with your colleagues as well. SFI is pleased to be presenting this webinar this afternoon as part of our Conservation Impact webinar series. And this is an effort to try to keep all of our program participants and partners apprised of the work that's taking place within our Conservation Impact portfolio. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But just to get started, we wanted to, of course, talk this afternoon about the effects of SFI fiber sourcing on BMPs in Georgia. And I'm going to let Puneet handle the real nuts and bolts of that project and tell you about how that's operated and what he learned. But before we even do that, I wanted to start out by giving a little background about SFI and about the Conservation Impact Project. Of course, many of the folks on the phone are very familiar with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and I won't linger too long on this, but just want to present it by way of background for those who may be less familiar, and also to explain how it is that we arrived at the Conservation Impact concept and some of the work that's taking place within that portfolio, including that of the University of Georgia. So you may recognize this slide, SFI being a sustainability leader, a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the future of our forests. There are three basic pillars of our work as we think of them. The supply chain assurances, which is the certification work that we're going to talk a little bit about this afternoon, and as well the conservation leadership segment, which is what I'm responsible for, and which cuts across some of the other work, including supply chain assurances and the other work that SFI does. I also want to mention that education and community engagement has been and continues to be an important aspect of our work. You may probably already know that SFI has recently adopted Project Learning Tree as an element of the SFI program, and we're proud to have them on board, and you'll be hearing yet more about that in the future as well. So let's talk a little bit about conservation impact, which is the rubric under which this webinar falls. The idea of conservation impact came to us a few years ago as SFI was turning the corner on 250 million certified acres in the U.S. and Canada. And we realized that in order to really make sense of the work that we're doing and being able to measure the conservation outcomes associated with that work, that we needed to have better metrics that could define and enumerate the conservation outcomes associated with SFI's certified lands and also associated with SFI's fiber sourcing programs. And so just as a reminder to you, if you could please mute your phones if you're listening in, we'd appreciate that very much. So we elected to engage in some projects to help us develop metrics based in sound science and research that are repeatable and translatable, and which will help us to connect the dots and communicate the conservation-related values of SFI's work. And when I say that, I mean the work of our program participants in helping to connect the dots through the supply chain. So the three topical areas we decided to focus on were around water and biodiversity and climate change including both carbon attributes and resiliency attributes. And for all the reasons you see here and for many other reasons, we thought this would be important to do. So since that time, we've engaged in a lot of projects. You'll hear about one of those this afternoon. But one of the interesting aspects of the project from the University of Georgia is that it relates very directly to our standards, that is, our supply chain assurances and certification. And just to remind you, SFI has 3 SFI standards: the Forest Management Standard, Fiber Sourcing, and Chain of Custody. And each of them does a little bit different things in order to ensure sustainability in the supply chain and sustainability of all the outcomes and natural resources associated with those forests. If you need more information about our standards, you can get them here on the SFI website, and there's a lot of supporting materials as well, which can be accessed there. Just to tell you a little bit about the scale of our standards in the global context, why they're so important, SFI occupies about a quarter of the global marketplace in terms of the footprint of certified forests across the globe. And so that's a pretty significant responsibility. And if you look at the place where SFI operates here in North America, our standards, of course, are applied just in the United States and Canada. And within the scope of that, we also occupy a lion's share of the certified footprint. But SFI's standards, of course, those forest management standards cover all the things that you would expect them to cover with regard to water quality, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, species at risk, and all the rest. And so that obviously is very, very important. The chain of custody standard covers the other end of the system, an accounting system that tracks fiber as it moves through the supply chain. Also very important. But the topic of our conversation today is really going to be focused around the impacts of the SFI fiber sourcing standard. And fiber sourcing does something that's really unique in the world of certification standards, in that it takes a proactive approach to promote responsible practices on non-certified lands and puts the onus on the procurement entity to ensure that there are sustainability practices engaged at the point of procurement. SFI is the only standard that demands this, so the fiber sourcing standard of SFI is really unique in the world of standards in that way. And just to elaborate on that a little bit more, the procurement facilities are certified, not the land itself. And in the United States in particular, this is especially important because of the 10 million family forest owners that supply 60% or more of the fiber used within the supply chain of wood coming from North America. And in Canada, there's a very similar thing, perhaps not as great proportionally, but still a significant share used by industry. And small landowners are not able to certify to the forest management standard. They have available to them, of course, the American Tree Farm System, but there's still a lot of procurement activities that occur on non-certified lands, and that's what the fiber sourcing standard is about. One of the things that we're very proud of and we want to point to, and Puneet is likely to mention this as well during his presentation, the SFI fiber sourcing standard requires the utilization of trained harvesting professionals. And since 1995, there have been a cumulative total of 192,000 training sessions and just 11,000 during the last calendar year. And you can see how the percentage of fiber supplied to SFI program mills was being delivered by trained professionals, how that number has risen since 1995. So this is an active program of SFI, something that we're very proud of, and we think it materially affects the sustainability practices that are engaged during the course of harvesting activities. And now we have some evidence to that effect, as shown by Puneet's work at the University of Georgia, which he'll tell us about. And just to look a little bit back on the history of BMPs, the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. There were amendments passed in 1987. There were analyses done during the course of that time talking about the relative impacts of forestry on water quality, and it became evident early in my own forestry career that we really needed to be attendant to those water quality practices, especially in harvesting operations, and that gave rise to the idea of forestry best management practices and the widespread adoption of those forestry best management practices within the forest industry. In the case of Georgia, since 1977, the Georgia Forestry Commission, or GFC, has been responsible for developing, educating, implementing, and monitoring the use of BMPs for forestry in the state of Georgia. And they were first developed and published in Georgia in 1981. Since that time, they've undertaken biennial surveys to monitor compliance rates, and that has taken place since 1991. And SFI's fiber sourcing standard, this is really important, requires the implementation of BMP practices so that forestry operations that are conducted under the auspices of the fiber sourcing requirements of SFI basically have BMPs required as an element of that forest operation. And we'll see what those impacts have been in Georgia in just a few minutes. So if you look across the GFC survey results of BMP implementation over the last couple of decades, you'll see a steady rise with only a slight variation in that rise, but basically a steady rise since the implementation of BMPs in Georgia. And you can see there on the timeline when the fiber sourcing standards of SFI were first implemented. And we'll talk today about the impact of the fiber sourcing standards on that rise of BMP implementation, what those implications are, both over the course of time and currently. Here's just a map, and this was generated by Puneet, our friend at the Warnell School of Forestry at the University of Georgia. And so Puneet can address this, as well as the research objectives and findings from his study. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Puneet Divivedi of the University of Georgia, who will tell us about the study that he conducted under SFI's conservation impact rubric and about those results. And then I'll take it back over and we'll close out the discussion and offer you all the opportunity for comments and questions as well. Puneet?
Oh, thanks, Paul, for the wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. So let me start from this map, actually. So as Paul was saying, that our forestry is dominated by family forest landowners who are close to a number of 10 million, and they are not like insignificant part of fiber supply. They supply up to 60% of total fiber to all the industry that we have in this country. And as we all know, that U.S. South is a dominant player when it comes to utilization of fiber in the industrial setting. And this thing is very important because majority of the forest lands in U.S. South is owned by family forest landowners and industry. So in total, overall, close to 80 to 90% land is owned by private entities which are supplying fiber to the industry. Now, industrial lands are definitely, most of them, if to best of my understanding, are certified to SFI, but as a lot of land which is owned by family forest landowners is not certified to SFI standards. So now what happens if you are industry and you want to make sure that your supply are consistent in terms of environmental performance, then you have to make sure that the wood that is harvested from a family forest landowner forest is harvested in a manner which is consistent in terms of environmental performance, legal performance, so on and so forth. So that is why the role of fiber sourcing standard becomes so important, because this is a tool which is ensuring sustainability of forest lands and forest management practices over its space and time. Now, with this in mind, we started doing some literature synthesis that what is going on in fiber sourcing standard, what is there in the literature, and so on and so forth. And not surprisingly, we found that practically there is no scientific literature which talks about impact of fiber sourcing standard on the overall sustainability of forest land, especially in U.S. South. So then we thought as a group that it will be interesting area to study because fiber sourcing standard is important for ensuring the sustainability of forest land in the country, but especially in the U.S. South, where majority of the land is owned by family forest landowners. So with this in mind, we came out with two research objectives. The first research objective was to analyze the percentage of land and forest land influenced by the SFI fiber sourcing standard. And the second objective was to examine differences in BMP implementation rates across survey sites located inside and outside of the sourcing radius of wood-consuming mills certified to SFI fiber sourcing standards. And in short, I'm not going to use so many words. If a mill is certified to SFI fiber sourcing standard From now onward, I will just call it SFI mill. So these were two research objectives for this research. Now, once you have research objective, you have to find out where you are going to actually implement those research objectives. So in this case, our choice was not a big problem because we thought to focus on Georgia for two reasons. First of all, or actually for three reasons. First of all, Georgia is the largest state in terms of land east of Mississippi. And fortunately, Georgia is the largest state when it comes to land under forestry. Close to 25 million acres of forest of total land in Georgia is under forestry. So those were two main reasons. And the third reason was that, as I mentioned before, practically there is no help from science in terms of already existing study which you can see and get some hint in terms of how you are going to achieve your objectives. So working in Georgia was much better option for us in terms of making sure that we are minimizing our risk in terms of what we are promising to SFI and actually achieving those objectives. So that is why we decided to work in Georgia itself. And definitely a minor reason was that we have a lot of industry in Georgia, and Georgia was one of the pioneering states when it comes to fiber sourcing standard, as you must have seen in that graph. Paul showed that fiber sourcing started in Georgia way back in 1990s. So we thought that risks are low, we have good sufficient data thanks to GFC surveys. Also, we can see the impact over time because we started fiber sourcing standard way back in 1990. So combining all these things, we thought to work in the state of Georgia. Now, method is pretty long, but since we have very limited time here, so I will summarize the method in basically one slide. So it's very simple actually. So first step of method was to get data, and so for that thing we surveyed all the mills in Georgia and find out when they got certified to fiber sourcing standard. And in case somebody did not respond, then we refer to secondary literature to find out when those mills became SFI mills in the state of Georgia. Then we contacted our friends in Georgia Forestry Commission, and I must say that I'm very thankful to them for all the help that they have provided to us for successfully completing this research. So GFC gave us data starting from 1998, 2002, 2004, all the way to 2015. But as Paul showed before, the actual survey started from 1991. So for these first 2 years, 1991 and 1992, we did not get any data from GFC. So as a result of which, we were not able to analyze that data for this research. Now for 1998, they gave us data, but the survey instrument that they used for doing 1998 assessment versus the survey instrument that they used started from 2002, they were very different. So we thought to be consistent in our analysis, it will be good to drop 1998 data set too. So that is why all the analysis that you are going to see in this research is based on data sets which start from 2002 and onwards. So once we have we know, so now we know based on these two steps that where are the survey sites located, starting from year 2002, which was given to us from Georgia Forestry Commission. At the same time, we know that where are the mills and when they got certified to fiber sourcing standard. So with these, we use these two pieces of information in ArcGIS, did some advanced spatial analysis to figure it out. Basically, what is the BMP implementation rate within the wood basket of a mill certified to fiber sourcing standard. And for that, we use two sourcing radius, 40 miles and 50 miles. Then once we got done using ArcGIS, we retrieved our data that we needed to run regression models. And for this particular research, we have used 2-bit regression models because the BMP implementation rate is censored between 0 to 100%. So that was the only reason using 2-bit regression models. Now, the interesting part, results. So first things first, just to describe the results to all of you. So we found out that in 2002, prior to 2002 survey or GFC survey, there were only 7 SFI mills in the entire state of Georgia. But as you can see from this figure, this number has gone up by fourfold. And when we summarized our data for 2015, we found out that overall 28 wood-consuming mills are SFI mills in the state of Georgia, which is really a good news because that shows the impact and power of fiber sourcing standard for ensuring sustainability of forest land in general in the state of Georgia. Now, on the right-hand side, on your right-hand side, you will see that what is the influence of fiber sourcing standard over the land base of Georgia itself. So if you assume that a particular SFI mill is sourcing from a wood basket which is 40 miles in radius, you will find out that in 2015, almost 30.9 million acres in Georgia, which comes out to be 81% of total land mass in Georgia, is under the influence of fiber sourcing standards. But if you put a sourcing radius of 50 miles around these SFI mills, we'll find out that 93% of total land base in Georgia is influenced by fiber sourcing standards. And these two numbers are huge, especially if you compare them to 2002 numbers. So that shows that how the influence of fiber sourcing standard has gone up in the state of Georgia. Now coming on to the next slide. So the earlier slide basically tells you things, but this slide, as you can see here, shows the spatial extent of fiber sourcing standards for the entire state of Georgia. So again, as you can see, there are only few places where you will not find influence of fiber sourcing standard in the state of Georgia. And not a big surprise, Atlanta is one of them because I'm sure nobody is going to put a wood mill next to Atlanta. So that is why you see some white spot close to Atlanta, which is still not governed by fiber sourcing standard, and also a little bit portion of the northern area of Georgia. But remind you, that portion is white because we have not considered SFI mills which are located in surrounding states of Georgia. If we start putting a sourcing radius around those mills, which are SFI mills, but not in Georgia, but bordering states like Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, I'm pretty sure that white space that you see on the top of Georgia will also go away. Now, little white area is basically south of Augusta, west of Savannah. So that was basically that is because of the reason that there were some mills which were earlier certified to SFI standards or fiber sourcing standards, but the ownership changed, and so they were in the process of getting certified when we were finishing our survey. But if I do same analysis for 2017, I'm pretty sure this white area that you see south of Augusta, that is also covered by fiber sourcing standards. So long story short, up to 93% of total land in Georgia is under the influence of fiber sourcing standard if you put a sourcing radius of 50 miles. Another interesting thing that you can see here is that impact of fiber sourcing standards is all across the state. And the reason is very simple, because SFI mills are located all across the state. They are not clustered in one corner of the state, like some other states like Texas or Oklahoma. So that is why you see practically all the state is green in this particular figure. Now, this was the land mass, but we are foresters. We want to know how much forest land is under the influence of fiber sourcing standard. So combining data coming out of national land cover data sets and our own analysis, we found out that in 2015, almost 90% of forest land in Georgia, assuming a 50-mile sourcing radius, was under the influence of fiber sourcing standard. And as you can see from this figure, this number has gone up quite a bit, from 50%, almost 50% in 2002, all the way to 90% in 2015. So that shows a remarkable influence of fiber sourcing standards on the forest lands of Georgia. Now, I was talking to somebody who is not from this country, some person from Europe on some other matter, and unfortunately we don't have certified forest lands in the state of Georgia. But when I showed this graph to him saying that, BMPs are important indicators of overall sustainability, and as you can see, almost 90% of forest land is somehow under the influence of fiber sourcing standard. And that was the end of the discussion in terms of ensuring sustainability of forestry resources in the state of Georgia. Now, coming on to some more data crunching apart from spatial. So I cannot report real coordinates of GFC survey sites because of non-disclosure agreement and because of privacy issues. So I'm using an example here just to tell exactly how we have proceeded in our research here. So let's say this red star that you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but this star that you see here, let us assume that it is a SFI mill, and let us assume that we have 35 survey sites all across the state of Georgia in 2002. And then what we did, we created a 40-mile buffer radius around this SFI mill and counted all the survey points within that sourcing radius and then found out what is the average compliance rate for all those survey sites which were within the wood basket of that SFI mill. So that is how we have proceeded and analyzed the data for the next slide. So this is a summary of exactly what I explained to you in the last slide. So as you can see, starting from 2002 all the way to 2015, number of surveys or number of survey sites have gone down from 314 all the way to 187. And now it seems to me that GFC is basically stabilizing around 180 survey sites for every 2 years to analyze what is the average BMP compliance rate in the state of Georgia. So which is not a bad number because they do it randomly and from a stats point of view, that should be okay. I have not checked it, but it seems to be a reasonable number. Now, coming on to the sourcing radius, as you can see, in 2002, when there were only 7 mills, SFI mills in the state of Georgia, only 45% of the total sites were inside the wood basket of these mills, and 55% of total sites were outside the wood basket of these SFI mills. But the situation is totally opposite in 2015. Out of total 187 sites, 160 sites, which is 87% of total sites, are within the wood basket of SFI mills versus only 25 sites out of 187 which are outside. So again, that shows the power of fiber sourcing standards, right? And if you go on 50-mile sourcing radius, the overall story doesn't change. In fact, the story becomes even better in terms of total sites within the wood basket of SFI mills. So then what I did, basically I found out at a 40-mil sourcing radius that what is the mean BMP implementation rate on survey sites located within the sourcing radius, and I found out that those were 92.3 over time. This is all the data started from 2002 to 2015. And same thing I did for all those sites which were not within the wood basket of sourcing rate of SFI mills, and I found out that that comes out to be 90.9. Same thing I did for 50-mile sourcing radius, where all those survey sites which were within the wood basket of SFI mills, their average BMP implementation rate was 92.1%, versus those sites which were not inside the wood basket, their survey mean implementation rate was 90.5%. Then the question becomes that whether or not these mean implementation rates differ significantly from the stats point of view. For that, we did Wilcoxon sign rank test, and we found out that these two BMP implementation rates for sites inside the wood basket versus sites outside the wood basket, they differ significantly to the extent of 99%, which was a really good news because that shows that yes, somehow, which shows that fiber sourcing standard is that shows that BMP implementation rate on those survey sites which are located within the wood basket of SFI mills is definitely higher in a very positive manner, in a very significant manner than those sites which are outside the sourcing radius over time. Now, then I got more excited, as the problem with researchers is. So then I did more analysis in terms of finding out that how significant is the influence of SFI mills in determining BMP implementation rate. So for that, what we did is basically, so this is the example, again, because of NDA issues with Georgia Forestry Commission. So now let us assume that there are two SFI mills. One is here, another one is here. and then they are again sourcing from 40-mile radius, then you can figure it out basically how many survey sites are overlapped by one SFI mill sourcing radius, by two SFI sourcing radius, three SFI mill sourcing radius, and so on and so forth. So we did that analysis in ArcGIS to find out how many overlaps are there on a particular survey site over time, over space and time. So once we have that data, we put that data in a table format, and for convenience purpose, I'm just reporting data for 40-mile sourcing radius, but results don't change. Even basically results are same for 40-mile sourcing radius. So as you can see here, mean over time, if you see the data, you will find out that those sites which never had any kind of overlap from a SFI mill, their mean implementation rate was 90.9%. But as you can see here from this table very clearly, as number of overlaps are increasing, mean implementation rate is going up. And I ran a Kurzweil-Wallace test to find out whether or not these mean implementation rate differs across number of overlaps, and we find out that yes, they differ significantly. So again, that shows that not only being within the wood basket of SFI mill increases BMP implementation rate, but also BMP implementation rate goes up as number of overlaps are increasing, which is again a good story when you think about the power of fiber sourcing standard and the influence that they have in ensuring sustainability of forestry resources in the state of Georgia. Now, so this is mean BMP implementation rate, and they are different from those sites which don't have any overlap. But still, we don't know the exact difference. So for that, I did some regression modeling. Unfortunately, in Georgia Forestry Commission databases or surveys, they don't collect data about the type of training that logger has gone. For example, Paul was referring that they have organized so many training sessions for loggers, and logger training is an essential part of fiber sourcing standard. But unfortunately, when GFC, they do their surveys, they don't collect the level of preparedness of loggers. So we never had that data to begin with. But the data that we had from GFC, they collect information about the ownership, who was the owner of that particular survey site, what was the terrain, what was the region. In terms of Georgia, we have 4 or 5 regions, and what was the slope on that particular survey site. They also calculate what was the total harvested acres, which I have not used for this analysis, but for the future, for the paper that we are planning to put, I am going to use harvested acres in that regression model to see the influence of harvested acres on the mean BMP implementation rate. But for this research, I have used only 4 variables and number of overlaps. So just to summarize the data points, all 1,700 points that we had for this survey. So as you can see from these 4 figures, if you see your figure on your top left, you will find out that in the state of Georgia, most of the plots or survey sites were located on family private landowners, and that which is reflected here by the blue color, and which makes sense because almost 60 to 70% of total land in Georgia belongs to family forest landowners, right? And as you can see from the orange graph, their average compliance rate was 90% on these all 1,200 sites. Public lands are few, public forest lands in Georgia are not many. That is reflected here for sure. But as you can see, on public land, compliance rate was close to 95%. And same story in terms of compliance rate on corporate forestry industry land. But they only have 400 sites, service sites on those type of land ownerships. Coming on to terrain is not a big surprise. BMP compliance rate was lower on rolling hills, which is again is not a big surprise because following BMPs on a rolling terrain is much tougher than following BMPs on a flat terrain. In terms of region, as you can see, upper coastal plains and lower coastal plain had the highest compliance rate versus all other type of regions that we have in Georgia. And coming onto the slope, definitely BMP compliance rate on slight slope sites were much higher than those sites which were moderate slope or severe slope. And as you can see, the good thing is that most of the survey sites were basically on slight slope sites, which makes sense because we have a lot of harvesting which happens in lower coastal sites. So, but this is the brief summary of the data set that we have used for running a regression model in our analysis. Now coming on to the regression model itself. So as you can see here, this is a 2-bit regression model. So the way you can interpret these numbers is that the ownership NIPF, which is non-industrial private forest land ownership, the mean BMP implementation rate on family forest landowners was 8.2% less relative to BMP implementation rate on public forest land. And this is pretty much reflected in the last graph that I showed you. Same thing when it comes to terrain. Rolling terrains have a lower mean BMP implementation rate than those sites which were located on plain areas. Same thing in steep terrain, same story basically, not a big difference there. They are lower than the flat terrain. And finally, I found out that number of overlaps, as they are increasing, BMP implementation rate goes up to the extent of 99%, which is really a good news. For example, as you can see here, if a particular survey site is overlapped by 3 or more wood baskets of SFI mills, mean BMP implementation rate on those sites will be 7.56% higher than those sites which had 0 overlaps. So again, these regression numbers are telling the power of fiber sourcing standard in influencing BMP implementation rate in Georgia over space and time. Now coming on to the next slide. This is a previous slide talked about the influence of number of overlaps. This slide is basically talking about what happens if a site is within the wood basket and outside the wood basket. And as you can see, these numbers are again for 40-mile sourcing radius, but things don't change quite a bit if you are running regression model for 50-mile sourcing radius. If I remember it right, the 3.61% that you see here, which is again significant, changes to 5.6 when you are analyzing for 50-mile sourcing radius. So as your radius goes up, the influence of fiber sourcing standard becomes even better. So keep that in mind. So as you can see here, up to the extent of 99.999%, fiber sourcing standard is significantly influencing in a positive manner the BMP implementation rate in the state of Georgia. Now, I think, Paul, it's your turn to discuss the implications of the results.
Yes, exactly so. Thank you, Puneet. I appreciate that. So I'll just wrap it up with a couple of slides here at the end to offer the discussion. And we'll also give you a chance, Puneet, to offer your acknowledgments, and then we'll open the floor to questions. But just by way of discussion and closure here, it's clear that the SFI fiber sourcing standard is favorably influencing these managed forests, at least from the standpoint of BMP implementation. It's higher on sites located within the wood basket of mills, and as Puneet just explained, that influence seems to be compounded or multiplied in some way where those wood baskets, in fact, overlap. And so a couple of the things that we hope to look forward to is to think about the impact on biodiversity of appropriate BMP implementation on harvested areas, so that the influence of fiber sourcing, although it's specific in this instance that has been measured to increase BMP implementation, that we also know that there are other elements of the fiber sourcing standard that speak to other issues such as wildlife habitat and the protection of species, as well as other elements of biodiversity and other attributes. And so we look forward to continued analysis to try to better understand those biodiversity contributions as well. So stay tuned, and we'll try to offer some of those ideas in the future. Puneet, I do want to offer you the chance to offer these acknowledgments here.
Sure. Before I go to acknowledgement, I want to say one more, add to the point that Paul mentioned. So in this analysis, we have just found out basically that BMP implementation rates are higher on those service sites which are within the wood basket of SFI mills versus those sites which are not, and the influence goes up as number of overlaps are increasing on a particular service site. But still, we have not teased out the influence of SFI in increasing the BMP implementation rate, as you can see from this figure. So our next step is basically to look into to link BMP's fiber sourcing standard with biodiversity, especially considering the fact that U.S. South is the hotspot of aquatic biodiversity. So that line of study will be very helpful. At the same time, our next target is to basically tease out the exact role of fiber sourcing standard in increasing BMP compliance rate over space and time in the state of Georgia. So that is where at least I am planning to go in the future. Now coming on to acknowledgements, first of all, I am really thankful to Chantal Tumpak. She did all the hard work in terms of data management, analyzing and reporting and everything else. And she was a master's student with me at Warnell School of Forestry, University of Georgia. She just graduated with flying colors, and now she's going to start her PhD program at Oregon State. I hate to lose her, but students have their own priority. I think somehow they like West more than South. Now also, I must say that I am very grateful to Chase Cook, who is our SFI coordinator at Warnell School of Forestry and looks after all the SFI stuff in the state of Georgia. A special thanks to Bob Isler. Definitely his guidance and all his expertise and understanding of forestry, especially in South, was very helpful in even coming out with the research objectives, because understanding fiber sourcing standard is a little tricky, especially when it is one of its own kind. So thanks to Chase and Bob Isler, they have been great partner to work with. And definitely a big thanks to Scott Thaxton, who basically gave us all the data without asking anything except non-disclosure agreement. So really, we are thankful to Scott Thaxton and Georgia Forestry Commission asset. And I have not mentioned here because I wanted to say it for sure that I'm also very thankful to Paul Rocco and all the group at SFI for funding this research and also being so flexible as we are moving in this research, because as I told, risks were very high. And if flexibility was not there, we would have not achieved what we have achieved as a group. And with this, thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Puneet. We appreciate that. There you see Puneet's contact information if you have interest in reaching out to him. And certainly if you fail to record that here, certainly you can contact me and we'll get that to you as well. Before we open it for questions, I'll leave it on this slide and make note that this webinar has been one of what we consider to be a series of webinars sort of shining a light on our conservation impact efforts and helping our program participants and our other partners to understand the impact, what we believe to be the favorable conservation-related impacts of SFI's work and the work of our program participants. And so we will continue to have these webinars, and so please stay tuned for information about upcoming webinars in the series, which will continue to touch on our conservation impact topics of climate change and water quality and biodiversity as well. So with that, I'll open the floor to questions and comments. You can unmute your line and ask a question, and I'll do my best to referee. As well, you can type into the chat box on your screen and type into the question section or the question and answer section, and we'll do our best to get those questions addressed. So with that, we'll open the floor, and we have about 15 minutes left for questions.
Hi, Paul. Tat Smith here. Got a question?
Yeah. Hey, Tat.
Hey, Paul. Hey, Puneet. Really nice study. Thanks for sharing your results. Just in the interest of the rigor of the logic underpinning the methodology here, I wonder if you could comment on the degree to which proximity may or may not be seen directly as reflecting the implementation of say, the SFI standard. Is it possible that there's just a coincidence, or are you pretty sure that there's a cause and effect going on here? Just wanting to make sure that the interpretation is as rigorous as it needs to be. Thanks.
So that's a very good question, actually. So basically, our analysis is based on correlation as of now. We don't have cause and effect as of now. That is why I mentioned in the end that right now we are just analyzing that if a survey site is located within the wood basket of an SFI mill, whether or not mean BMP implementation rate is higher on those sites relative to those sites which are outside the wood basket. So that is what we have analyzed, and I think based on our analysis, that makes sense. But as you are saying, that we need to run some more models. The name of the models are differences in differences to exactly tease out the impact of fiber sourcing standard from the trajectory of increased BMP implementation rates that you see in the state of Georgia. So definitely, we are working on those lines. But assuming a 40-mile radius and 50-mile radius around SFI mill should not be very wrong, because nothing is right when it comes to modeling, because of the fact the way our industry operates. So we don't have data that if on a particular survey site which was harvested or which was surveyed by Georgia Forestry Commission, whether or not actually wood was sent to an SFI mill. We don't have that piece of information. So keep that limitation in mind for this particular research. And unfortunately, we cannot get that data no matter what happens.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I thought that's what you had said you were planning on doing for the next steps. I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Tat, let me just add to that and say that intuitively, even though the evidence, Puneet as a researcher is very careful to state this correctly, but intuitively, because the overlap effect seems to increase BMP implementation rates, that does seem to suggest that there's a relationship there, a causal relationship. But of course, Puneet is careful not to point to that unless it can be proven.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. Thanks.
It could be, but it seems to me, as Paul said, it could be the case. But since I have not analyzed it, I cannot say with 100% confidence.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions or comments? Remember to unmute your line if you wish to weigh in with a question. All right, I don't hear any questions, and I don't see any in the chat box either. So we'll offer one last opportunity, and then we'll close the webinar and give some time back to our participants if you'd like. One last call for questions. Okay then. Well, let me say thank you to all the participants today, and especially to Puneet and his team at the University of Georgia. Puneet, we're very appreciative of your work and your thoughtful perspective on the impact of SFI's fiber sourcing standards, so we thank you for that. Everyone, please be on the lookout for more to come with regard to the webinar series, and also plan to attend, if you can, our annual conference this year, which will be held near Denver, Colorado. And if you need information about that, you can check in with us or check our website. But there will be a section within the annual conference this year which will focus on the conservation impact projects, what we've been able to learn, and the direction of future projects, and its relationship to the marketplace, which I think you'll find very interesting. So please plan to join us then. And with that, I'll say good afternoon to all, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, everybody. Go Dogs.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Puneet and Paul.